The worst lies aren't told to you by other people. They're the ones you start to tell yourself after hearing their voices on repeat for years. You're not talented enough. Be realistic. Who do you think you are? I heard all of it. From the people who were supposed to love me most. For decades, I tucked my dreams away in a drawer labeled foolishness and tried to live the life they approved of. But a dream you bury doesn't die. It just grows roots in the dark. My name is Cassandra, and I'm here to tell you what happens when you finally dig it up. Hello. Welcome to Hurt Stories. My story doesn't begin with a grand, mocked ambition. It begins with a feeling, a specific, vibrant frequency of joy. For me, that frequency was found in two places: the smell of wet clay and the sound of a weaving loom. My grandmother, my mother's mother, lived in a small cottage on the edge of town that smelled of lavender, linseed oil, and possibility. She was a potter and a weaver, not as a hobby, but as a state of being. Her hands were always marked with earth or thread. In her studio, time didn't exist. I was maybe 6, 7 years old, sitting at her potter's wheel. She'd place a cold, wet lump of gray clay in my small hands. "Now, Cassie," she'd say, her voice soft as the hum of the wheel, "you have to have a conversation with it. You don't force it, you listen. Your hands are just asking the clay what it wants to be." And under my clumsy fingers, something would happen. The wobbling mass would find a center. It would rise. It would become a small, lopsided bowl, a vessel I had coaxed from the earth. The feeling was magic. It was sovereignty. It was a quiet, profound dialogue between my imagination and the physical world. At her loom, it was the same. The rhythmic thunk-clack of the shuttle, the slow, pixel-by-pixel creation of pattern from 1,000 separate threads. She'd let me choose colors. "This one," I'd say, pointing to a skein of cobalt blue, "is for the deep part of the lake where the mysteries live." She never corrected my whimsy. She wove it in. That was my original blueprint, a world where creating beauty was a valid, vital way to spend a life, where your hands could tell stories that words couldn't. My grandmother saw the spark in me. She called me her little maker. She'd say, "You have the seeing hands, Cassie." It was the purest form of validation I have ever known. When I was 9, my grandmother passed away. The studio was cleared out. The loom sold, the clay dried up and discarded. The frequency of joy in my life went silent. I took the silence home, to our practical, clean, goal-oriented house. My family, my parents, my older brother loved me. I want to be very clear about that. They were not monsters, they were providers. They were strivers. My father was an accountant, my mother was a school administrator. Their world was built on pillars of stability, security, and measurable achievement. Report cards, salary brackets, sensible cars, a 30-year mortgage. Their love was expressed through foresight, through worry about my future, through a desperate desire for me to avoid struggle. So when I started to talk about being an artist, a potter, a weaver, their reaction wasn't cruel. It was a series of gentle, logical translations. I'd show my mother a painting. Her response, "It's lovely, sweetheart, but you know very few people make a real living at that. Maybe you could be an art teacher. That's a steady job." I'd tell my father about a story I was writing. His response over the newspaper, "Writing is a tough racket. You need a fallback. Something in business communications is more versatile." My brother, pragmatic and popular, would just laugh. "You're gonna be a starving artist in a garret? Come on, Cass, get real." They translated my dream of being a creator into the problem of how to be a consumer. How would I pay rent? Buy health insurance? What was my 5-year plan? My dream, to them, wasn't a calling. It was a risk vector. Their mockery was never the evil stepmother variety. It was subtler, more corrosive. It was the eye roll at the dinner table when I mentioned a gallery opening. It was the helpful brochures for paralegal programs left on my bed. It was the sigh of disappointment when I brought home a B in math, but an A+ in art. "Your talent is fine for an elective, Cassandra, but it won't get you into a good college." Slowly, insidiously, I began to internalize their translator. The voice in my head that once said, "What if I make a vase with a spiral like a galaxy?" now said, "But what would you do with it? Who would buy it?" I started to see my own creativity not as a gift, but as a liability. A character flaw of impracticality I needed to correct. So I buried the blueprint. I enrolled in college as a business major. The clay dust was washed from my hands, replaced by the feel of a calculator and Excel spreadsheets. I told myself this was maturity. This was being realistic. I was being a team player for the family I would someday have. For 20 years, I lived a proxy life. I was successful by all external metrics. I climbed the corporate ladder in marketing. I became very good at selling other people's products, at crafting campaigns for other people's visions. I married a kind man who, much like my parents, valued stability. We bought a house, a nice, sensible SUV. I made spreadsheets for our vacations. But there was a haunting. In museum gift shops, I'd linger by the ceramics, running a finger over a glaze, feeling a physical ache. I'd see a beautiful textile and my fingers would twitch, remembering the pull of the weft. I'd have vivid dreams of my grandmother's studio, only to wake up in my beige, professionally decorated bedroom with a profound sense of homesickness for a place that no longer existed. I became what my family had wanted, capable, stable, and deeply, quietly miserable. The mockery had won. It had moved from their lips into my own psyche. I was mocking myself daily, dismissing every flicker of creative longing as self-indulgent, unproductive, a waste of time. The cost was a kind of spiritual anemia. I was functional, but I wasn't alive. I was running on a ghost energy, fueled by the shoulds and ought-tos of a life that was never mine to design. The breaking point, again, wasn't dramatic. It was a slow leak that finally burst. It was my 45th birthday. My family threw me a party at my parents' house. There was a nice cake, sensible gifts, a silk scarf, a gift card to a department store, a new planner. Then my brother, now a very successful financial advisor, clinked his glass. "A toast," he said, smiling, "to my little sister, who finally listened to reason and made something sensible of herself. We were all so worried you'd end up as a hippie weaving baskets somewhere, but look at you, a VP. We're so proud we talked some sense into you." He meant it as a compliment, a testament to their good guidance. The table erupted in laughter and agreement. "Oh, we remember your artist phase," my dad chuckled. "Thank God that passed." In that moment, sitting at the head of the table with my silk scarf and my VP title, I felt something inside me crystallize, then shatter. This was the narrative of my life. I had been a problem they had solved. My dreams were a childish phase they had successfully medicated out of me with a dose of reality. My true self was the embarrassing relative they had managed to hide in the attic, and they were now toasting their own cleverness for keeping her under lock and key. I smiled, I nodded, I died a little more inside. Later that night, back in my perfectly appointed home, I stood in my walk-in closet. I looked at the rows of tailored suits, the sensible heels. I looked at my reflection, a professionally highlighted 45-year-old woman with empty eyes. And I heard my grandmother's voice, not as a memory, but as a clear, present echo in the silent room. "You have the seeing hands, Cassie." I looked down at my hands. They were manicured. They were good at typing reports, holding steering wheels, signing checks. But they hadn't seen anything, hadn't asked anything of the earth in decades. They were tools for maintenance, not for creation. That was the crack. The realization that the life I was living was a betrayal, not of my family, but of that little girl at the wheel and of the grandmother who saw her. I had traded my seeing hands for their approving nods, and the trade was bankrupting my soul. The next morning, I didn't call a life coach. I didn't quit my job. I got in my sensible SUV and I drove to a craft store. I walked in, overwhelmed by the smells of acrylic paint and wood. I found the aisle with the clay, not the fancy potter's clay, just some low-grade oven-bake modeling clay. I bought a few blocks, a few basic tools. I took it all home, cleared the kitchen island, and I just sat. I stared at the sealed block of terracotta-colored clay. I was terrified, not of failure, but of feeling that frequency again. What if it was gone? What if I opened it and felt nothing? What if my family had been right and it was just a phase? I tore open the package. The smell hit me first, that damp mineral scent of earth. A visceral memory flooded me. I broke off a piece. It was cold. I started to knead it, warming it in my hands. The stiffness gave way to a familiar plasticity. I didn't try to make anything, I just felt it. I rolled coils. I pressed my thumb into a ball to make a crude pinch pot. My hands remembered. They began to have the conversation. What do you want to be? Tears streamed down my face, dripping into the clay. They were tears of grief for the 30 lost years, and they were tears of recognition. The frequency was still there. It had just been muted, waiting for me to tune back in. That was the start. I began to steal time, an hour before work, Saturday mornings. I bought a small, second-hand tabletop loom and hid it in the guest room. The thunk-clack was a metronome for my healing. With every pass of the shuttle, I was weaving my way back to myself. Of course, I couldn't hide it forever. My husband was the first to notice clay under my fingernails, stray threads on my sweater. He was confused. "Is this a new stress thing?" I told him, haltingly, that it was an old soul thing. He didn't understand, but he saw a light in my eyes he hadn't seen in years, and he was wise enough not to question it. My family was another matter. The first confrontation happened at a Sunday dinner. My mother noticed a small, glazed bowl I'd made holding lemons on my counter. "Oh, that's interesting. Where did you get it?" "I made it," I said, my heart pounding. Silence, then the chuckle, the familiar, patronizing chuckle. "You're taking a pottery class. That's a nice hobby. Good for you to have a creative outlet from the stress of work." I put down the knife I was using to chop herbs. "It's not a hobby, Mom. It's a rediscovery." The table got quiet. My brother smirked. "Uh-oh, midlife crisis alert. Don't tell me you're going to quit your job and become the next big thing in ashtrays." The old me would have shrunk, laughed it off, agreed it was just a silly hobby. But the me whose hands were remembering their sight stood a little straighter. I looked at him, and then at my parents. "Why is that so funny to you?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Why is the idea of me creating something beautiful so threatening?" It wasn't anger I felt. It was a deep, weary clarity. Their mockery was never about the practicality of art. It was about control, about the worldview they had built, where value is only quantifiable. My dream was an affront to that worldview. It was messy, unquantifiable, and it came from a part of me they could never access or approve. By mocking it, they were trying to drag me back into the fold of the comprehensible. I didn't argue, I just stopped sharing. I built a boundary, not of brick, but of silence. I stopped seeking their validation for this part of my life. It was the single most liberating decision I ever made. I didn't blow up my life overnight. I was 45 with responsibilities. But I started to steer the ship, inch by inch, toward my own true north. I scaled back my VP role to a 4-day work week, using the pay cut to fund a real studio space, a rented garage not far from my home. I filled it with a proper wheel, a kiln, a floor loom. It became my sanctuary, my holy ground. I started an anonymous Instagram account, just posting photos of my work. No face, no story, just the objects. A vase with a glaze that captured a stormy sky, a scarf woven with the colors of a forest floor. People responded. They felt the intention in the work. I began to sell pieces. Not enough to live on, but enough to prove to myself that my vision had value in the world, that it could resonate with strangers even as it was mocked by my own blood. The balance was everything. I was no longer the corporate sellout or the starving artist fantasy. I was a hybrid. My business acumen, earned in those decades in the wilderness, became an asset. I could price my work, manage my studio finances, and market my creations with a savvy that many lifelong artists struggled with. My corporate career was no longer my identity. It was my patron, funding my true work. My relationship with my family entered a new, distant phase. They don't visit my studio. They still make the occasional joke, but it has lost its power, because I am no longer living in reaction to them. I am living in conversation with my clay, my threads, my own spirit. Their laughter is now just background noise from a shore I have rowed away from. This journey taught me that mockery is often the weapon of the threatened. Mockery is a projection of fear. When someone mocks your dream, they are very rarely commenting on your capability. They are broadcasting their own fears of failure, of instability, of the unknown. My family's realism was their own terror dressed up as concern for me. The timeline is a lie. We're sold a narrative that if you don't make it by 30, you failed. Nonsense. Some seeds need a long, cold dormancy. My dream needed those 30 years in the dark to gather the strength, the resilience, and the life experience to finally break through. At 45, I wasn't late. I was right on time for my story. Validation is an inside job. Waiting for your mockers to finally say, "You were right," is a prison sentence. You have to become your own grandmother. You have to be the one who sees the spark in yourself and says, "You have the seeing hands." External validation, when it comes from the right places, is beautiful, but it cannot be the foundation. The sensible life can be the riskiest. What is riskier? Pursuing a dream with your whole heart, or spending the only life you have living someone else's idea of safety? The regret of not trying is a far heavier burden than any financial instability. Your dream is your true native language. Those years in the corporate world, I was fluent, but I was speaking a second language. It was exhausting. Returning to creation was like returning to my mother tongue. The words, the shapes, the textures, the colors flowed from a place of deep, innate knowing. Never let anyone convince you to be mute in your own language. If you are holding a dream that has been laughed at, dismissed, or folded neatly into a drawer by the people who claim to love you, I am not here to tell you to quit your job tomorrow. I am here to tell you to open the drawer. Take the dream out. Hold it in your hands. Feel its weight. Does it still hum? Does it still feel like yours? Start small, secretly, disrespectfully. Steal an hour. Buy the cheap clay, the beginner's guitar, the notebook. Reconnect with the frequency of joy, however faint the signal. The people who mock you are mapping their own limitations onto your horizon. Don't let them shrink your world to a size they can comprehend. Your dream is not a phase. It is your core. It may take you decades to circle back to it, and that's okay. The years in the wilderness are not wasted. They are compost. They enrich the soil from which your true life will eventually grow. You can live a proxy life, and on your deathbed, you can tell stories of how sensible you were. Or you can live your own life, and on your deathbed, your hands, your seeing, knowing, creating hands, will tell their own story in the things they brought into the world. They mocked my dreams because they couldn't see them. Now I live them, and the view from here is so beautiful, I don't even need them to see it anymore. I see it for myself. And that, my friends, is the ultimate victory. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more story like this, please like the video and subscribe the channel. Hit the bell icon to get notified.